why in the city? In other words, why focus in the city, right? Rather than a lot of sustainable agriculture is focusing in rural areas and larger expanses. And here are some of the reasons. The biggest one is the top one here, which is that, you can think of a city as a giant, tightly managed organism that we're already putting a lot of energy into, right? Urban municipalities are spending huge amounts of resource managing water systems, trees that fall down, sewer system, buildings, and energy. It's just, huge crews of people, many millions of dollars, even for a small city. A lot of energy going into all that for very little yield from a lot of perspective, right? So a lot of energy is being put in, and usually a given task only serves one function, right? Like the city crew picking up downed trees or tree limbs and cutting tree branches to clear power lines, and then it's just going to the landfill in a lot of cases, right? That's a majorly squandered resource and squandered human energy. So the thought is that in cities, a lot of times if we can just redesign the way that we're using human energy and using materials, we can get a lot of benefits while basically just spending the same energy, right? See what I'm saying? So it's like not even asking more input, just to use the input in a different way. It's also where most of the people are at this point. In the US, it's more than 50% of the people are now in cities. So it's like if we're gonna be affecting people, taking care of people, ethic of permaculture, working in cities is a huge part of it. We can't just abandon cities and say, oh, everyone needs to move out to the rural areas. Although, as you'll see in my little essay at the top of your handout, I do think that we need to get some of our people out of cities and have a lower proportion of our total population in cities and more people out participating in active food production at a larger scale. A lot of people through the historical processes of the United States, for instance, have been concentrated who are poor and from all kinds of marginalized racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds because of the economic dynamics of the United States have ended up in cities, whether they like it or not, to work with people for whom this is not just another layer of luxury. We have to actually work in cities. And then climate change. So it's like, if we're gonna do anything about this one, y'all, we have to be on it right now. And how do ideas spread? That's a big part of the question I'm constantly asking myself as an educator is how is it that ideas take root in people's lives and people own those ideas themselves and then start to create many variations of effect using these ideas. And it turns out that in cities, ideas spread quickly, right? Whether they're good ideas or bad ideas, they spread quickly. So it's a high leverage place. If we can get it going on in cities and in suburban places, then that can have a lot of leverage because it can affect a lot of people and cause the ideas to spread quickly. Which, by the way, David Holmgren, who's the other founder of permaculture, who lives in Australia now. Bill Mollison, the elder founder, died this last year, but in his late 80s. But David Holmgren is releasing a book in the next couple of months specifically on suburban retrofitting. The whole book is all about dealing with subdivisions, all the tragic subdivisions that have been built all through the US at this point, creating massive urban sprawl. He's like, all right, that sucks that happened, but now it's happened. And how are we gonna actually turn these suburban neighborhoods into essentially retrofit eco-villages? That's what his point is like, actually, these things are laid out with all these houses together in close proximity. They're walkable within each other, even though currently they're used as isolated nuclear family units and people hardly even know each other in most of them. They can be changed. Yeah?
Well, in another perspective of looking at that, your first two bullets, but saying it more explicitly, we always think that one of the challenges is getting people back to the land. Well, that's the land where the people are. So we don't have to get people back to land. People are on land.
That's right.
We're just squandering.
That's right. Just got to change the ideas. Right. That's right. The mentality. Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah, and some of the houses in suburban developments are 3,000 to 6,000 square feet, and so all right, that's easy for me to judge. Whatever, but those houses don't have to be used the way that they're used right now. Those houses can be used to house 15 people, and in fact, that is historically what happens. That's what happened during the Great Depression in the United States. Is when There were all these big houses that have been built, Victorian era houses, like in Montford and Asheville is one neighborhood that I'm aware of that I lived in, where there's huge summer houses built by the rich to come live. Those became, you could call them boarding houses, but they became communal houses, 10 people, 15 people living in a house that was designed to be lived in by one graceful Victorian couple. We don't have to just imagine all this, that actually there are plenty of historical and current examples of cities in the world where food production and wise design is a deeply ingrained part of the city. And this book, Patterns Language by Christopher Alexander, is a classic that still has so much to teach, that was written in the late 70s by Christopher Alexander and a slew of colleagues. They were architects and they were studying the way that cities were built and homes were built before the Industrial Revolution. And why before the Industrial Revolution? Because before the Industrial Revolution, people had to rely on the way their buildings were built and the way their cities were structured to have good transportation, to have good heating in the winter and cooling in the summer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for thousands of years, we designed cities intelligently because our ancestors paid attention and wanted their food to not spoil in the summer and wanted to not roast in the summer and wanted to stay warm in the winter, et cetera. So, right? But then as soon as we got the Industrial Revolution and our cheap glut of fossil fuel energy, we started pretending like that stuff didn't matter, and we stopped paying attention to how buildings and cities were designed. So this whole book is written about the patterns in how to design cities and buildings that are intelligent in terms of human use and energy use. And then this is an example that Beijing, 70% of the milk and the non-staple vegetables that are eaten in the city are grown in the city. 70%. By way of comparison, in Asheville, only 5% of the vegetables that are eaten in Asheville are grown within 100 miles of Asheville. Even with the big local food movement, as sexy as it is and everything like that, it's still a tiny percentage. You could phrase that as a tragedy, which it is, but you could also phrase that as an opportunity. And there's $3 billion annual food economy in Western North Carolina, where I live. Only 5% of that is staying in the region. So talking about job creation in Western North Carolina, if we brought back actually just 70% of the agricultural jobs that were in Western North Carolina in 1950, we would be down to 4% unemployment rate, which is what economists consider the baseline unemployment rate, right? People looking for jobs. That's how many jobs can be created through redistributing farming as in livelihood. And I'm going to go into this in a second, which is a little urban permaculture design, and talk through this. But I wanted to go back and do a little more framework on permaculture before that, which is, I was talking earlier about how all the main insights in permaculture are derived from observing natural patterns and observing human patterns. And then all that was taken by these guys who made permaculture and turned into what are called the permaculture design principles, which is a set of principles that David Holmgren calls them doorways into whole systems thinking, into the house of whole systems thinking. A good way to visualize it for me is that any system needs to be like a body, like a complete body, right? In my body, there are things to take in nutrients, there are things to expel nutrients, there are all my different organs. And that's an archetypal thing where actually if you look at it, and there are a lot of indigenous people in the world who call different parts of the landscape by different body parts. Like, oh, that's the liver, right? That marsh over there, that's the heart, that's the brain, right? You actually name the different body parts of the landscape and recognize the landscape as a whole organism in that sense with the interconnected pieces. And so whole systems thinking is thinking where we're trying to make whole systems that are like that, where there's nothing that is an unused resource, right? It comes from the recognition that waste is a verb, not a noun. There is no such thing as waste in nature. Where's waste in nature? Everything is food for something else. Wasting is something we do by refusing to let things serve their function as a food for something else. So we're constantly trying to redesign whole systems in permaculture. It's a deep, holistic design practice for doing that. And the design principles are these set of, depending on which permaculture lineage, anywhere between 12 and 20 principles that are these insights derived from natural ecosystems of how to design whole systems. And the idea is that, yes, Fred?
I was just going to say that in Durham and probably lots of other places, we have a system of picking up yard waste, and we have these brown giant container things, and on the side it says yard waste. And I've been lobbying the city to change the name and to put on there organic matter,
Right.
Yard organic matter.
There you go, change of mentality,
Well,
exactly.
it's not waste, it's
Right.
Generate waste.
So the idea here is as you get started with permaculture principles, and again, and we teach permaculture design classes where we go deep into all this stuff for 20 days. There's one at Earth Haven next summer, but is not to have to go through all the principles every time you're designing something, but rather to train yourself to think in this way so that you reflexively, every challenge you approach, you're thinking in a holistic way. It's always, how is that connected? How is that feeding other things? How is that being fed by other things? That's why what David Holmgren said was so good, that each of these is a doorway into the house of whole systems thinking. It's like each one, and we'll start to see that. We're going to talk about them here. So I articulated a few of them to go through, and actually the very first one is not officially a permaculture design principle, but I want to emphasize it for you all because it's so important, this idea of goal articulation, like I was saying at the very beginning in response to someone's comment. So it's so important to say out loud to ourselves and to other people who are stakeholders in whatever project we're doing, what in the world is it that we're trying to do? So many times we can get into projects from an unclarified, an unclear set of motives, and we end up taking a bunch of actions and using a bunch of resources that don't actually serve the deep goal of what we're trying to do. And especially if you're in a group of people, then it turns out that you all had different assumptions about what you were trying to do. And if you don't go through a goal articulation process, that turns into conflict later on. And that's the single biggest source of failure of endeavors and land projects in my experience as a permaculture designer is people not articulating goals together clearly enough at the beginning and making sure that they're on the same page at that early stage. And yes, things change as you get into it and you learn more and you have to re-clarify your goals and so on, but getting it as clear as you can at the beginning. To give another example for that, the distinction we make in permaculture between goals and strategies. A lot of times in even like a conference like this, we might get fascinated with some certain technique, like growing oyster mushrooms is a technique. All right, growing oyster mushrooms, useful for lots of things, and it could very well make sense within your system. And yet, if you're gonna try to do it at a commercial scale, what is that trying to do? What are you trying to do by growing oyster mushrooms? Are you trying to make income? Are you trying to do micro-remediation of petroleum compounds around a parking lot? Are you trying to just grow some for your family to eat? Are you trying to grow some for your extended neighborhood to eat? Articulate those goals, because that's going to change the details of the physical system you're going to design. If you just do the system however Tradd Cotter shows you his system, well, he's doing it for his goals. And that system's going to look different than for your goals, unless you have the exact same goals as Tradd Cotter, which I doubt you do, right? So by articulating goals, we both winnow out ideas that aren't necessarily serving us, and also we sometimes identify ideas that we didn't think of. Like if my goal is to grow dryable, preservable food for the high protein preservable food for the winter, growing oyster mushrooms is only one way of doing that. I could list 20 other ways to grow preservable food with high protein for the winter. So by articulating that goal, you back up and you open more possibilities for yourself instead of getting obsessed with one idea. See what I'm saying?
And Zev, I was going to say, you've mentioned this in other workshops, but like making sure that the cultural piece is expressed. So
Yeah.
you're not finding yourself like isolated 30 miles from your friends.
Right. That's right. So the cultural goals. So for instance, you better have some cultural goals if you're starting a farming project. A goal like, I want to feel connected to the people I love the most. Seems simple, and yet how many farmers are working from dawn to dusk with no time to connect to the people they love the most because they didn't design their farming operation with that goal? Or, I want to make $35,000 a year and have health care. Seems simple, and yet how many farming operations aren't accomplishing that, right? And in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily just because the farming operation is failing to accomplish that, it's because that was never articulated in the first place as the goal. So goal articulating at the beginning, really, really important. And holistic management planning that is put together by Alan Savory is my personal favorite goal articulation. It's much more than just goal articulation. It's a whole project management strategy that's very deep and transformative Really worth it. He has a book out on it. Get the 2nd or 3rd edition if you get it. Integrate rather than segregate. So this is this is one of the official permaculture principles. Integrate rather than segregate. So what this says is whenever there are opportunities to take elements in a system, by the way, which could be a physical system or an organization that you're designing or a relationship, any kind of system, permaculture applies to all kinds of systems. Whenever you can integrate them rather than segregating them, that allows them to work together, right? A classic example on a cultural level of this is how in our society we have segregated different age groups of people and created all these problems through that, right? Whereas the old village style culture is you've got all the generations living together, the elder people are being physically taken care of by the younger people, the elders are helping to take care of kids during the day, helping to do hand tasks like winnowing beans, telling stories. All the generations are together, the childbearing age people get free childcare, right? Everybody gets their needs met through the integration. Instead, in our culture, we've broken all the age groups apart, and now we have to have schools that are separate, and elder care facilities that are separate, and people who have kids paying for childcare. It creates all these problems by disintegrating that integrated system, right? Same thing with like an example we often give in permaculture is chickens in a system. Well, you'll see, and maybe a lot of people do chicken systems where you have chickens in a chicken pen. And that's what they're doing, is being in a pen and they're getting fed corn. And now a lot of people are doing pasturing chickens, which is awesome. But also, what chickens like to do is to scratch and to eat insects and to eat seeds and some growing tips of plants, right? That's what chicken diet is, evolutionarily speaking. And so if you put chickens, say, in a forest garden or orchard setting where you have the fencing set up in the correct way to allow them in when you want them and not when you don't, then you can run the chickens in after you're done harvesting fruit. The chickens get to scavenge the leftover fruit as food, and also they can eat the larvae of pest insects. So before those larvae go into the soil and overwinter to create more pest pressure the following year, the chickens can break that cycle and reduce the amount of pest pressure while fertilizing the orchard or forest garden with their manure. So just by getting your fencing layout correctly and locating the chickens properly, you can integrate those systems together and create benefits for both, right? So integrate rather than segregate. Creatively use and respond to change and accept feedback. I actually kind of combined two principles from my lineage in this one, but so creatively using and responding to change and accepting feedback. This, again, seems obvious, and yet our entire society is not designed in this way to creatively use and respond to change and to accept feedback, right? So what this says is that biological systems are flexible and that we need human systems to be flexible as well, or else they're going to crack, right? Things that aren't flexible are fragile. And so how do we actually design systems, like I was saying, with the ability of permaculture farming to respond to climate change? How do we design our system to be able to respond to change, right? And there are a lot of tangible ways of doing this. One of the most significant ones is diversity. To have diversity in your system. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're farming like the Irish were, a single genetic line of potatoes, when in Peru they farm thousands of different genetic varieties of potatoes, what that means is that when that disease comes along, the potato blight, that they're all susceptible to blight. Boom, you just didn't respond to change, you lost your main food source. If you had 20 different genetic varieties, then some of those are going to be resistant to the blight, most likely. And that gives you something to work from then in responding to that future change. But then we should zoom out even more and say, well, why even just one species as a main food plant? No, I mean, people down, the native folks down in the Amazon rainforest, there have been anthropologists studying them, and they're like, wow, these people eat 600 species of plants a year, right? 600 species. Most of us eat 30 in our culture. And the more species of plants, that means that if a couple of them fail or there's not a yield something or 1 year, whatever, you got 598 other species to work with, right? You can respond to the food supply and work with, and they're doing their gardening practices, and it's very responsive. They can respond to whatever change happens. They've got an answer to it, right? Because they've got diversity. The more species possible, the more kingdoms possible, right? So not just working with plants and animals and fungi. Right? All those need to be part of an integrated system. And by the way, there's the other kingdoms now too. Are there 5 kingdoms now, I think, the way the biologists lay it out? And the other ones are microbes. And we're learning a lot more about that and how important microbiome is in actually setting up immune systems of people and plants and animals and fungi. A lot of the immune system is actually not human. It's all these other species that are living in our skin and in our gut and mucous membranes everywhere, and that they're actually doing the job of keeping us healthy. So that's part of the system too. And then accepting feedback. This is something that our culture is awful at. We are so bad at accepting feedback in this culture, like especially it's seen in the political realm, isn't it? So actually the whole principle is to self-regulate and accept feedback. This is the idea that we can anticipate the results of our choices and then make better choices for the next round based on self-regulating, on saying, oh, if I do this thing, then this is going to happen, right? Now, accepting feedback is actually like after we've had 30 years of climate change, deciding to actually do something about it. Not even anticipating it, but just saying, oh, this thing is happening, we're going to change our behavior. We're not even doing that, are we? So accepting feedback is designing systems that specifically are designed to receive feedback, interpret it, and change behavior based on that. At the farming level, at the relationship level, at the organizational level, all those things. So doing everything you can, in our classes, we always try to have questionnaires at different times throughout the class. How's this going for you? You give people an anonymous way to give us feedback and say, well, you're talking too much or whatever, and then take the feedback and change the behavior so that it's actually meeting the needs. And so this is so important in farming. It's like how often do we try the same thing over and over again because we really want it to work, right? And then it doesn't, it just keeps not working. So accepting feedback would be changing something about that each time. And acknowledging reality. We say when we're assessing a piece of land in permaculture, always look at everything that's there in the analysis, especially the things that you don't want to see. Which is also the thing in assessing relationships and organizations. That's the things we should focus on the most in setting something up is the evidence that you really don't want to see. Oh, is that house built on an old toxic waste dump, right? Or, oh, is there really low organic matter content in that soil? Or the power lines running overhead, right? In selecting the land. All things, why is this land so cheap? Everything has multiple functions. We talked about that. I'm actually just going to talk more about that in a minute. Valuing diversity for resilience. I kind of hit on that one in the creatively responding to change. And then growing like a seed. This one is actually the way we normally say it is to consider succession. So succession is starting usually, the way ecologists talk about it is with a disturbance. So say that you're in a big forest and a windstorm knocks down a patch of trees or a fire or a bunch of insect damage creates a patch of disturbance where there are a bunch of dead trees or a selective logging project. That lets sun down to the forest floor, and then what begins from that moment of the canopy gap opening up is what we call ecological succession. Ecological succession, so then what happens in that clearing? A lot of times fast-growing, self-seeding annual crops, like all of our vegetables, right? All the plants that we call vegetables and greens were pioneer species. They make thousands of seeds. Their whole evolutionary niche is to cast thousands of seeds that are ready in the soil for when a canopy disturbance happens, and then they jump up and grow a thick carpet of plants that outcompetes other plants. That's what pioneers do, is they compete, right? That's the ecological strategy of pioneers, is competitive horizontal expansion, low diversity. And then those prepare the soil for a next round of plants to come up. Those plants grow and the fungi and animals that go with them until they start to nurture the soil and moisture for a first set of trees to come up. And then the trees, they grow a first set of trees, like up where I am, it's usually black locust, sometimes white pine, a lot of tulip poplar. Those are the early set of tree species, and they change the soil ecology and enable a whole second round of species. And like in the western North Carolina mountains, the forest ecologists call old growth trees between 125 and 150 years old. So that's like the last stage, the mature stage of succession is old growth forest. But what a true old growth forest looks like is not an even stand of old trees, but patches at different ages. That's actually what creates the most diverse forest ecosystem, is patchy disturbance. So old growth forest ecologists don't actually call something an old growth forest until it's old enough to have really old trees and patches where they've died and have different layers of succession coming up. And those create habitat for all the different animals and all the different fungi living in close proximity to each other, which is what we're mimicking in permaculture systems. So that's what this comes down to. All those agroecological farming systems that we talked about a few slides ago, I didn't introduce this concept at that point, but what they all are is successional farming systems. This is the central insight of all indigenous agriculture around the planet, is successional farming. That people are working not just with annual crops like we are obsessed with in the United States, but yes, annual crops, not just annual crops, and not just forest crops, and not just shrubs, but the whole cycle of succession, because we get different foods and medicines and building materials and useful yields from every stage of succession. So on a given site, you want different patches at different stages of succession at any given point. You want one patch that got cleared last year or 10 years ago that's still growing annual crops, another patch that got cleared 25 years ago that's got young trees and fruiting shrubs in it, another patch that was cleared 70 years ago all the way up to old ones, right? And then those things are managed intergenerationally. And we all come from people who did that at one point or another. Even in Britain, where a lot of ancestry on the East Coast came from, there's an old tradition, at least 1,200 years old, of really tight, elegant forest management that came after they brutalized the landscape and cut all the trees down. But then they learned how to do sustainable forestry called coppice forestry. And so that's successional farming is what that really is. And so the milpa style of farming, which is what I do, which is based on the Central Americans, Southern Mexican, that reached all the way up into the Cherokee here, style of shifting farming with corn, beans, and squash and other plants, that's a type of successional farming. But there are many types all across the planet. And so this is an insight that we have to work with systems and design systems to change like that through time, to go through the stages of succession. It's not saying one stage of succession is better than another stage of succession. It's saying we need them all. And then how do we mimic that in cultural systems as well as in farming systems? How does an organization go through cycles from its seed form, through its sapling form, through its mature form, and even recognizing that organizations have life cycles and need to die eventually?
Give an example of what you just talked about relative to patchy succession in the urban context on the small lots.
All right, urban context, small lots. That's great. Actually, that's in a way that's addressed in that, I think it's the first item on the handout that says to think about the city as an organism and our site as one site within it. That's the way I think about it, because so like my mom's plot is 1/6 of an acre in West Asheville. That's pretty small. We have what will be 4 large canopy trees total on that site, 3 pecans and a black walnut. And then everything else is only going to get to be like 15-foot diameter orchard style canopies. So on a site like that, you still could have some shifting rotation over time, but it's not like we're going to have big trees all over that site that are going to be coming down and creating areas for annuals. But on the urban scale and the neighborhood scale, that can be happening. And that's why it's so important to use collaborative organizational tactics like what are described in there, like I'm going to jump into here in a minute, to organize at the neighborhood scale. And then you can get that management going on. Because if someone has a bunch of beautiful 150-year-old white oak trees in their yard, I'm not saying you should cut down your beautiful, healthy white oak trees right now to grow broccoli. Actually, I think that the people growing white oaks should be harvesting acorns and raising ducks and shiitake mushrooms in the shade of the oak trees and trading those to the person 3 houses down who's growing mulberries and broccoli and all the sun-loving things and thinking about it at that scale. That's my opinion on that. Yeah, because this insight, it is with ecosystem scale management. It's like oak trees are big. That's right, and this is a good point at the end just to emphasize that this is something we have to say over and over again is to ourselves is that permaculture is not just a set of techniques. It's not forest gardening and mushroom cultivation and passive solar building. It's a way of thinking, right? So it's really about using the principles to train ourselves to think this way in each situation. And then we apply our way of thinking and we come up with novel new techniques in every situation. It's not just applying the techniques. All right, so here's an example. This is a 2/3 of an acre site in East Asheville. And I think I finished this design in 2012. And they've implemented quite a bit of it at this point. This is a main road coming in down here to a cul-de-sac down here. It's actually an old subdivision. And then The French Broad River is down here, and there's a drainage that used to be a creek before it got urbanized coming down through here that makes its way down to the French Broad River. And so, the first thing we tend to look at on a site is water flow. That's one of the first things anyways. What is water doing on the site? On this site, there's a steep slope right in here, and and every time that it rained, water from the roof was going onto the downspouts, onto the ground, pouring down this steep slope and creating erosion gullies, and then pooling up and creating different pools down in this flat area before making its way down to the drainage and down to the river, probably carrying a lot of nutrients with it each time because of that erosive dynamic. And so the first thing we were like, all right, we got to deal with the water. So a central part of this whole thing is dealing with the water, and we installed a 1,200-gallon cistern right there in the ground because she didn't want it above ground, and an 800-gallon cistern here above ground. Those both are piped through underground lines down to a set of hydrants all along here, because I always try to set it up so that you never have to drag a hose more than 50 feet, especially in a small system like this, right? Because it's such a pain in the butt dragging hoses everywhere. So if you can have hydrants, yard hydrants through underground lines distributed throughout the landscape, then you can hook a hose up for drip irrigation or for hand watering without having to drag more than a 50-foot hose. So there's a single trench that takes from here that takes those lines down and makes water available through the whole landscape. And then the overflow, because you always need to plan the overflow for cisterns, right? You always have to know what the overflow is going to do. Otherwise, the overflow comes out the top and pours down the side of the cistern and erodes under the base of the cistern. So you got to plan the overflow. Goes through the same trench and fills up this pond. And that's this pond, actually, when we were in the middle of building this pond, because we did this in the Permaculture in Action class. It's what I call a swale pond, even though this is on a gentle slope. A swale is used in permaculture to describe a trench dug on contour, or it's actually a difference between a trench or a ditch is V-shaped, and a swale is U-shaped, right? And there are reasons for that, but not to go into all that. But in permaculture, a swale is usually used to mean a contoured swale, whereas in landscape architecture, it can mean one that's not contoured, but it's for drainage. So if you put it on contour, a pond like that, it allows you to build a long, skinny pond that creates maximum surface area of access to it for hand watering. This pond is 70 feet long, but only 15 feet wide here and 10 feet wide there. So it gives you the most access points to get in for dipping, for hand watering, and for other uses. And it creates the least technical construction process for the dam on the downhill side, right? Especially if you're on a steeper slope. If you build a long, skinny pond, then that is a short dam on the downhill side. If you try to build a big, wide pond on a slope, that's a very tall dam. See what I'm saying? And if you get over 8 feet in height, then you have to get an engineer involved because it becomes a larger liability and more technical construction process. Yeah?
How do you feel about using old tires to stabilize a steep slope where there is one like that to actually make a swale like that? I've made one half the way I want to make it probably, and I'm considering low cost available materials that don't take a lot of time. And everything will hold up, where that's not a situation for crowd.
I am very reluctant to ever build a pond that needs a retaining wall on the dam, personally. So I that's kind of a litmus test for whether a slope can support a pond. If you're going to need to build a retaining wall for the dam, that's too steep of a situation, or you're trying to build too big of a pond for that location. So if there's a compelling reason to build a pond there, then okay, use tires, but yes, they're toxic, and know that there's going to be effluent downhill from them of where I probably wouldn't eat food from within a certain zone next to the tires. But yeah, I mean, once tires exist, it's like take responsibility for them by using them, or to send them to the landfill and pretend like they don't exist. So I support that. Yeah. So swale pond here, and then just to start to show how kind of an example of the integrative thinking can go. So this pond, what functions does it serve? All right, it's in proximity to the duck house, which is right there, and the ducks themselves, if you can see from where you're sitting, there's this double fence row around this raised bed vegetable garden, like the one I showed earlier with the branching path pattern and stuff. And the fence serves as the trellis around the edge of the beds. but there's a duck run, I call it. So it's like an 8-foot wide pathway created by 2 parallel fences. And the ducks, why do you think I have the ducks in a duck run around the garden? It's a duck patrol, especially for slugs, because remember how I was saying this is a low wet area? We observed a lot of slug action going on in there. And so what slugs do is they migrate across the surface of the ground at night, usually from wetter areas, to go eat the vegetation they want to eat. So they're migrating across the surface of the ground, and suddenly they hit a giant cataclysmic duck event, you know? And ducks eat them, and we like that. And so the ducks are patrolling this. We put wood chips down in that pathway, so the ducks are pooping on that, and that's generating a manure-rich mulch, which can then be just brought out a short distance to fertilize the forest garden and all the plantings in these areas, right? So it's close proximity to those. And then the ducks, when we want to, we can just open a gate and let them out into this pond. Now, a kind of pragmatic word about ponds and ducks, which is that ducks have really high impact on ponds. And you can't let even 3 ducks into a small pond, like I would call this a small pond, for more than 1 out of 7 days and expect them to not turn it into a giant muddy mess. Now, this one is a lined pond, and in most urban situations, you have to use a liner. This is an EPDM liner. So it's a manufactured synthetic rubber liner, because if you don't have a constant flow of water, the water will perk through the pond walls and you'll lose water quicker than you can get new water. So it's not as susceptible to muddying by ducks as a natural earthen-lined pond is, but it is still susceptible, and they'll kill all the plants. If you're trying to grow aquatic plants, the ducks will trample and eat plants in the pond if you let them in too much, right? So the other thing that we do then is having a duck watering trough, which is depicted up here, which is a little trough with a float valve in it, right? It can be anywhere between like a 20-gallon little trough and a 100-gallon cattle watering trough. And what that does is that gives the ducks access to constant water, which they need, because they actually need water to swallow food, ducks do, right? Not just to play in, it's to swallow food. And then they're gonna muddy that little bit of water up, and you put it at a high point, so you can then use gravity to drain that dirty water to a point that you need nice fertilized duck water, and then replenish that water frequently. So that's how you give them access to water all the time, is through a small amount you can replenish frequently and use that fertilized water, and then the pond is reserved for occasional duck festivities, yeah. And then the other reason to let them out into here is because we have a 200 log little mushroom operation leaning up against that fence. And so also slugs, in my experience, are the most difficult problem on mushroom logs, because they come up when the logs are fruiting. They come up and crawl up the logs and chew slimy holes in all the mushrooms. And so you let the ducks out with the appropriate timing when the mushrooms are fruiting and let them patrol around the base of the logs, eating slugs that would crawl up the logs. And then the pond itself is there to be able to soak the logs to induce fruiting, because if you that's a sizable mushroom log array, right? For home use, 200 logs. I actually think that's a good scale for home use. If you want to have mushrooms as a significant food source, is about 200 logs for a family. You can have mixed shiitake varieties that fruit at different temperatures, oyster mushroom varieties, and maybe some lion's mane and a few kind of less common ones mixed in there. But especially with the shiitakes and oysters, which are the staple mushrooms, kind of the easiest ones to grow, you can then soak them to force fruiting in rounds. And that way, rather than it just raining and you have 200 logs fruiting all at once, and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with all these mushrooms? You soak 20 at a time through the summer and always have a batch fruiting fresh mushrooms. Which, by the way, quick little tip on that, the turning the gills up to make vitamin D. I don't know if y'all know about this, but this is something that Paul Stamets discovered. If you turn, especially shiitakes are the ones he's studied, and he's speculating that other mushrooms do it. If you turn their gills up in the sun for 1 to 2 hours, they rapidly manufacture the precursors to vitamin D in the mushroom to the level where if you leave it for too long, it's actually a toxic level of vitamin D. But so you can make your own vitamin D supplement by turning the mushrooms up in the gills up for a couple hours and then drying them regularly with the gills down. And then you have dried vitamin D supplement for the winter when you're not getting all that sunlight. So then the pond also is uphill of this forest garden area, so we can use gravity to flood irrigate the forest garden with the nutrient-rich water, and the overflow from the pond makes its way down to it's not depicted in this drawing, but it's a shallow, what I call a pit swale, which is like a contact lens shaped pit with elderberries planted in the middle, and then wood chips piled up around them. So what it essentially does is it gives you a place for the overflow water to go to, fill that up, and then slowly percolate, catching the nutrients from that water and feeding the elderberries. And then finally, if that fills up, that overflows down and down into this creekway going down to the river. So we have, 1, 2, 3, 4 opportunities at least to use that caught and stored water before it leaves the system. That's how we try to do it, is like recognize any resource like water or nutrients and catch and store that in the system, providing many opportunities for each thing to be used before it leaves. Is there a question back there? Yeah.
You put a lot of effort into your design, and it's a really knowledge-intensive system that you're creating. So I'm a designer, and I work in Washington, D.C. And I'm curious how you value your time, and how you express that to your clients. So how you value your own time, and also how do you foresee the future management when it's a lot of years of experience to learn and maybe pass off that knowledge, and maybe this is your baby that you're creating, and I don't want it to, be mismanaged, or I want it to progress, the succession to progress in a certain way.
God, that's a great question. Come talk to me more about that after the class. My entire life is an answer to that question, actually. But how to communicate the value of this, right? And also, professional permaculture design like I do is an early stage successional strategy for our culture. In other words, like I was talking about succession, right? That we're not going to need professional permaculture designers after we actually have a regenerative culture, because then that knowledge is going to be passed down through intergenerational knowledge transfer the way it always has been. This is an early stage way of jump starting this type of knowledge and practice. And like all early stage technologies or thought processes, there are early adopters, and the early adopters are my clients. It's people who are more committed to doing this than perhaps simple economics demands, right? Although also, I'd be curious to talk to you about how much you charge for design, because I've talked to other landscape architects and I'm like, people charge way more for landscape architecture. And then the second part of your question about how they manage and implement it is about education and hands-on education. And that's why I developed the permaculture in action classes, was my recognition that wow, the level of knowledge required to actually implement and manage and harvest and process the yields from this, that's as big a thing. You got 60 species of plants in this site, and each root in medicine has a different processing and use technique. How do you even learn how to do all that? It has to be hands-on education and developing community collaborative organisms where you have sets of people who are teaching and mentoring each other and sharing skills in an organized way. So that has to be integral. That's different from landscape architecture, where it's just like you hire someone to do the design, a professional landscaper installs it, and then someone comes and trims the hedges and mows the lawn. It's much different than that, obviously. So that it's a cultural thing. It's another way in which it's a cultural thing. So great question. Thank you. All right, I just want to talk a little bit more about this and then move on. So that was kind of the water system and things organized around the water system that we were talking about. And then just to give another couple examples of kind of techniques and ideas that I use a lot. So, right, so this is south is this way. And you can see here this other double fence row. It actually goes all the way around there. It's like a U-shaped double fence row. That also is a run for chickens. And now, all right, so starting to think in permaculture, thinking now, what is it that you think the chickens might be doing there?
Scratching up the ground.
Scratching up the ground. Why would you want them to scratch up the ground?
Yeah, prepping it.
Say again?
Prepping it.
It could be prepping it. Mm-hmm.
Is that where water, you said that's where water goes, like?
Yeah, the water kind of ends up pooling down at that corner. Not pooling, but making its way to that corner. Not so much over there. I'll give you a hint. The neighbor has, it's too big of a hint. The neighbor has a giant wisteria problem.
They're eating all the seeds.
Yeah.
The seeds.
That's right, the seeds and the foliage of wisteria and scratching up the root systems, right? So chickens, what's that?
If the roots get exposed, hopefully they'll dry out.
Exactly, and they do help with, and so we've done this since then. It's not 100%, I'd say it's like 70% with the wisteria. With Japanese knotweed though, it's 100%. Chickens love Japanese knotweed. by the way. So if you ever need to control Japanese knotweed, chickens are a great way to do it. Whether it's with a rotational fencing system or a permanent fencing corridor like this. So this was to deal with plant migration. It's saying, right, what do chickens do? They scratch. How can we locate chickens in the landscape in such a way that they're actually serving their function well and doing something good through their scratching?
You have to worry about gap practices and things like that.
Oh,
so
right.
they can drain duct looking.
That's right. The type of function that CFSA has served, obviously, is legislative advocacy. And an interesting research question would be, what would be a comprehensive list of legislative policy that we would like to promote to allow small-scale urban permaculture farming to succeed and be legal? That would be an interesting starting question, wouldn't it? Yeah. And one more technique that I use a lot, which is, so this is up here on the southeast face kind of the house, and they had a deck out there that was a wooden deck that was dark colored, and we just observed as we were walking around, always walk through the house as part of the permaculture system. The house is totally part of it. It's where we spend most of our time, a lot of us, right? This deck was roasting in the sun and pouring heat in these big sliding glass doors on that side of the building. So what we put in was a hardy kiwi arbor. This is something that maybe y'all have seen before, but hardy kiwi is a very vigorous vine that is totally hardy in temperate regions of the planet. Actually, fuzzy kiwi, the kiwi that you buy at the store, is also hardy around here. You can grow fuzzy kiwis too if you get the right varieties. And so I use hardy kiwi a lot for passive solar cooling of buildings, right? You can actually influence the microclimate of a building a lot. Like in that example I gave at my mom's place with the bamboo structure shading the side of the house and the heat pump. You can influence the microclimate of buildings a lot by shading a perimeter zone around them. And so by putting hardy kiwis growing over this, a kiwi vine can grow 10 feet in a growing season, sometimes more, 15 feet even. So I grow them in a trunk and cordon arrangement. You might be familiar with that from grape growing. And it's basically you have main trunk vines that come up to the joint at 8 or 10 feet, and then they have arms called cordons that go off, and you prune the vines back to those cordons each winter, so it lets all the sun in the winter, and then grows back in the spring and into the early summer and creates deep shade over that deck. And then you've got kiwis. So you can get yourself into plenty of work on 2/3 of an acre, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is this going to be a full-time job for that couple?
Yeah, well, so, so I was saying yes to acknowledge the question. No, not full-time. So what the way that this is shaken down, and by the way, there's so much I want to talk about here. This is a backyard elf dwelling, which is another pattern I work with and talk about on your sheet. The idea of building small structures in your yard for 3-season residency, usually for a young farm helper kind of person who wants to have a free place to live and help you out part-time managing your permaculture landscape while creating affordable housing. So a little backyard elf housing that's also an outdoor kitchen and food processing area in the downstairs of it with the lodging in the upstairs of the same building. Anyway, so I brought that up because you asked about the labor. And so what this has turned out being is about 20 hours of human time in a week. She puts about 10 hours in. She's in her 60s, and then she hires a young man in his early 30s to do another 10 hours a week of work in there, and he kind of does the heavier stuff and she does the lighter stuff. So it's about 20 hours a week that they're putting in right now, and that's continuing to implement additional features as well as manage what's going on there. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to end on this note. There's plenty more to talk about, but it was like, see how far we get. And I mentioned some of these things, I think actually all of them in your handout, but I want to just speak to them briefly because this is some of the most powerful stuff that you can go away with today. You know, all of the techniques and everything, like there are a lot of great books actually coming out in the last 5 years about permaculture techniques. I'll mention one of them, actually. This one is the Permaculture Handbook by Peter Bain, who he actually used to live at Earth Haven, and now he lives up in Indiana. And it has a patterns language for, he calls it garden farming. It's what we're talking about. It's integrated homestead to slightly larger scale agroecological farming. It's a really cool book, lots of good information in here. He was the editor of the Permaculture Activist magazine for a long time, so he's had access to hundreds and hundreds of articles and resources. But there are tons of great books coming out, especially Chelsea Green Publishing has kind of become a leader in publishing permaculture books. You can get that stuff from books. There are thousands of websites, there are databases, so many resources. Take permaculture classes with me, take them with other people to go deeper into all this. But this cultural stuff is what you're not actually going to read about and hear about as much, is the cultural design. So I want to spend our last few minutes talking about that. So just to go through them, active listening and true attitude of collaboration. So this is like a prime thing that people working in NGOs, non-governmental organizations around the world have learned, hopefully learned, which is that everyone has this mission-oriented thing. We want to go help these people. We want to go help these people. And then they go in and cast their ideas on some people who have their own lives and own life way and end up causing way more damage than helping. So that lesson is particularly visible in that type of really, really intense setting of poor countries, but it's also visible right here in our cities and right here in our collaborative relationships. And so this is kind of the principle I'm distilling from it, is like true deep listening. What that means is that if I'm going to work with someone, I'm assuming that they know things I don't know, and they have insights that I don't have, and that in order for me to do well, I have to deeply listen, actually allow myself to be changed by that, not just want to be heard, but to hear. And so to hear first, you know? So that's a really hard one to practice sometimes, right? Because we get all excited about our ideas and everything, but to like go in there with some ideas, but also with listening is the first thing. So if you're trying to start a collaborative group, like a neighborhood co-op, to set it up that way, design it so it's about deep listening, to start the thing off with and articulate goals, not just a charismatic leader. Charismatic leadership is good for an initiating thing, but it has to immediately turn into service or else the whole thing flops. Informal neighborhood scale collaboration and rotating work parties. I actually really hate the term permablitzes because it refers to blitzkriegs and Nazis, but it's a way of describing doing a big work push to get a lot of work done at a time. And we kind of did that with the Permaculture in Action class model. The idea is if you can get your work processes really organized, get your materials on site, get your tools, so that then when everybody comes, you can really effectively use human energy. Crew leaders are essential for this, by the way. Crew leaders, I know it kind of seems hierarchical or something, but it's really important. If you have more than 5 people, you need a crew leader for every 5 people there. And the crew leaders meet ahead of time and know about all the work processes that are going to happen, and they know the details. Because if you got one person trying to lead 20 people, it's not enough leadership happening. So distributed leadership with crew leaders for work parties. And then you can set up a neighborhood co-op and have rotating implementation work parties. Rapid assessment design groups and work classes. This kind of addresses what you in the back were talking about. Rapid assessment design is something that is used in so-called third world countries. We call them 2/3 world in permaculture because 2/3 of the people live in them. But rapid assessment is a way of going into a situation with very experienced people who've done a lot of the work and being able to do design processes in shorter amounts of time than it takes typically. And so rapid assessment design is an important feature that we need to get together to be able to go to a neighborhood and go through 40 different properties and come up with designs for all of them in a short period of time in a coordinated fashion and say, hey, everybody, can you get on the same page and be a neighborhood scale permaculture collaborative? Open up backyard fences so people can share chicken and duck flocks and have shared orchards and shared management and back up for each other so they can travel and then someone's there to take care of the ducks and all those benefits of collaboration, right? So rapid assessment design and the work classes like PIA. And then co-ops in general, cooperatives. We have a microgrid co-op in my neighborhood at Earth Haven where we have a single photovoltaic system that runs the electricity for 25 people in 15 different buildings through underground lines, way cheaper than everyone getting their own photovoltaic system. There are people doing urban microgrid co-ops too in apartment buildings and so on. Makes it very affordable, many less batteries, many less generator backups, all that stuff, than having individual systems. And then in the urban ones, like I was reading about one in Chicago, where they then have an electric car co-op off of the microgrid co-op that's charging electric car batteries when the other batteries are full. So now they're getting free travel essentially out of it, or at least free fuel. So on and on. So cooperation, the theme here is how do you get to a scale by working in cities where you get the benefits of collaboration, right? How do we work together at a scale that makes sense, but not such a big scale that you lose the personal relationships of the group? So that's the sweet spot. This very last idea I want to present you with The Mutual Aid Society, this is actually my big project that I'm working on kicking off in mid-November this year, is forming a WNC Mutual Aid Society. This is something that, if you can bear with me for just another minute or two, it's a really important, big idea that we've been using for a long time, our species, and formally in the US, there are Mutual Aid Society nonprofit IRS statuses, tax-exempt statuses, and what a Mutual Aid Society is a way of pooling resources among a group of people, usually in the thousands scale, to establish credit unions, community-owned credit unions, healthcare cooperatives, food cooperatives, educational groups. They used to run hospitals before the social safety net was installed by the federal government in the US. And mutual aid societies were a way that communities organize to take care of their own needs and also get politically organized to take back political systems. And so it was a big one used by African American communities in the US all the way from Jim Crow leading up into the civil rights movement, and was a big part, along with churches, of organizing the civil rights movement. And so they've fallen away a lot since then, but we need to get it together again. And so what mutual aid societies are forming a credit union, and then once you have a credit union with 10,000 people or more enrolled in it, you've got the millions of dollars to loan democratically decided loans to all the enterprises in your community that you need to loan to starting a healthcare cooperative, to funding farming programs, to starting up alternative schools, buying houses, starting businesses, all those kinds of things, many of which are not fundable by the conventional funding systems of banks who are invested in fossil fuel industry, right? So it's taking our money out and really taking our power back to do all the things that we need to do in our communities, like funding microgrid co-ops and all the rest. So this is a high-level strategy that I'm working on to develop one in Western North Carolina as a template for beginning to develop them on a regional basis throughout the country, so that we can actually get this going on and take our community power back and take our political power back. So you can check, if you're interested in that, on the newsletter list there, and I'll send you more information about that. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I'll be glad to take some questions if anybody wants to stay longer or come talk. And thank you very much.